Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Hope you've had a great weekend. Promises to be pretty hectic this week. Here's what's coming up on the show tonight. The online battle over censorship as the Albanese government demands that footage of Bishop Emmanuel's stabbing is taken down. Now, at the same time, the hate preachers in Sydney mosque that preceded it, well, they remain online. Don't be fooled here. This is the new front line of free speech, and it isn't easy to know where to draw that line. Get ready for more IR disputes and falling productivity, with the mining and energy unions pushing for unprecedented powers that would effectively see businesses paying for on-site union activity. And this is what happens when Labor owes their union mates and their mates call in the debts. Plus, with terrorism sadly back in the headlines, I'll speak to an expert about just how ineffective most of these de-radicalisation programs really are. Do not be fooled. And the latest news poll today has got the government worried. The coalition ahead again on cost of living, meaning pressure on the Treasurer is there to turn things around in the May budget. Or this will be a government that struggles to keep its grip on power.
The cost of living crisis in Australia is really beginning to bite. The best way that the government could help them is to get inflation and interest rates under control.
But first, especially in the wake of Bishop Emmanuel's stabbing last week, of course we all want to see the internet cleansed of violence and incitements to violence. But giving bureaucrats the power of selective censorship is not the way to go. Last week, the E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, issued takedown notices to Big Tech, ordering the removal of footage of Bishop Emmanuel's stabbing. Now, this is the same Julie Inman-Grant who declared this at Davos 2 years ago.
We are finding ourselves in a place where we have increasing polarization everywhere, and everything feels binary when it doesn't need to be. So I think we're going to have to think about a recalibration of a whole range of human rights that are playing out online, you know, from freedom of speech to the freedom to, to be free from online violence.
Now, let me say that again. She wants to see a recalibration of a whole range of human rights online. Also saying in that speech, freedom of speech is not the same thing as a free-for-all. Now, fair enough, take down the footage of the bishop's stabbing, but what about all the online hate speech that may well have motivated the alleged young terrorist? Like this, said of Bishop Emmanuel from one of Sydney's Islamist hate preachers. This is an individual, he said, who speaks against and hates Islam, who speaks against the Prophet. He said himself that he was ready to die for the words he has said. He said he understood that his words were causing anger and harm to the Muslim community. Now, that attempt to minimise, indeed justify the stabbing was posted after it happened. But the internet's chock full of incendiary material praising Islamist violence against anyone who doesn't believe in Islam. And we have already had reports that the young man arrested over the stabbing has also been praised, here and overseas, by Islamist radicals for the attack. Well, none of this has been taken down or subject to takedown orders. Given the speed with which Australia's E-Safety Commissioner has issued her takedown demand of the stabbing footage, you've got to ask, where was she or where's she been since October 7? And what has she done to combat the flood of anti-Semitic hate speech? Because what she's doing now, by demanding the takedown of the video of the bishop being stabbed by the accused terrorist, is trying to deal with the result of the radicalisation, but not its cause. Now, this is my problem with the post-stabbing move by the government to revise and strengthen its proposed legislation against misinformation and disinformation. It could easily become a weapon of the Orwellian left. Because who gets to define what's what? Why the stabbing of the bishop and not the hate that helped cause it? So far, here and overseas, actual online censorship has been very one-sided. A good example is last year's Voice referendum. During the campaign, virtually all the online material that was deplatformed was from the no side, including my editorials, pointing out that the Uluru Statement was actually 26 pages of grievances and demands, not the simple one-page poster the Prime Minister had claimed. Now, I am not a free speech purist. First and foremost, I'm a conservative before I'm a libertarian. I'm happy enough to see sick, degrading imagery, child sexual abuse material, instruction manuals, let's say, for evil and acts of terrorism. I'm happy to see all of that taken off the internet. But this latest example from our E-Safety Commissioner is a very selective instance of removing violence. And it's hard to have any confidence that the bureaucrats will be better than the platforms themselves at deciding what to leave and what to remove. And these platforms seem incapable of restraining their left-wing bias. I mean, take this from Meta, Facebook's parent company. Meta's new artificial intelligence tool has today ranked Australia's best 5 prime ministers. Gough Whitlam, Bob Hawke, Julia Gillard, Anthony Albanese and Malcolm Turnbull. Are you kidding me? No Menzies, no Howard, and Turnbull, the sole Liberal. Now that proves 2 things, doesn't it? First, that AI is still the slave of the assumptions that get programmed into it. And second, those assumptions are incorrigibly biased. In ordering the big tech platforms to take down the Bishop Emmanuel stabbing footage, the E-Safety Commissioner didn't publicly specify any reason other than her judgment that the stabbing footage depicted, quote, gratuitous or offensive violence with a high degree of impact. Yet this is hardly the only material available online that promotes, incites or instructs violence. It seems these takedown orders are simply the subjective as well as the selective judgment of one largely unaccountable individual. Is this what's to become of the right to free speech? Always considered the most fundamental of our freedoms, because all the other freedoms are pretty meaningless without it. This is the danger with knee-jerk policy on the run to deal with a serious problem, that we could end up reducing one problem while exacerbating others. The real issue here is a total failure by big tech to take any responsibility for what happens on their platforms, and the ability of people to post the most scurrilous and over-the-top material under a cloak of anonymity. Declaring in law that Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, the whole lot are not platforms but in fact publishers, that they can and must be held accountable for anything that appears on the platforms, well, that would force them to clean up their acts. I mean, that's the rule here at Sky News. We're liable for whatever goes to air. So we have to take care about what we say and who we give a platform to. Now, currently that's not the case with big tech, but it should be. And what about requiring people to identify themselves when creating an online account? You can't open a bank account or get on a plane without proof of identity. So why should anyone post anything they like, even violent and degrading material, without declaring who they really are? In its search for a simple fix to a serious issue, the government could easily end up passing the wrong laws rather than the right ones. And believe me, removing free speech from democracies like ours, that's always been the holy grail of the hard left. So a warning to everyone, we need to tread very carefully here. Look, the Albanese government's decision to give $1 billion to subsidise the manufacture of solar panels on the old site of the Liddell power station already looks like a problematic white elephant. Yet another example of this government throwing your hard-earned tax dollars at a cause that's dear to its left-wing heart, that neither needs your money nor stacks up as a business case. That's because the winning bidders of this $1 billion in free money, or at least it's free to them, could and should have funded it themselves. AGL, well, it's a highly profitable company, as you know, and the rich listers backing the SunDrive project, Mike Cannon-Brookes and Malcolm Turnbull. Well, they're more than capable of using their own money if this really is a business that makes sense. And why this doesn't stack up as a good use of your money is that at the same time as the government is giving AGL and or Turnbull and Cannon Brooks this money to build solar panels here in Australia, it's dropped its case against China for dumping cheap, inferior renewables into our market. Up to 95% of solar panels come from China. And what's more, the price of solar panels has reportedly dropped by 70% over the past 2 years. So much so that the world's biggest solar panel manufacturer, China's LONGi Green Technology, is reportedly cutting its workforce by 30%. Because, as the International Energy Agency warned in January, there's a massive solar panel glut, with supply more than double anticipated demand. Indeed, as reported in the Wall Street Journal in recent days, the French solar panel manufacturer Photowatt only survived due to cash injections from the French government. Its orders have plunged, reports the Journal, as customers are lured away by solar panels imported from China at rock-bottom prices. Now, obviously, the business geniuses inside our government here had no knowledge of this. AGL, well, it probably did. And it was doubtless happy to take taxpayer money, knowing they could always ask for more, because there isn't an area of green virtue signalling that this Prime Minister won't throw your money at, whether it gets wasted or not. I mean, if this government has money to lavish on businesses, it should have found the cash to keep open Qenos, our biggest plastics manufacturer, that closed on the weekend. Again, at the hands of the Chinese. We need plastics manufacturing in Australia if we're to have some sort of national resilience. This is way more important than overpriced Australian-made solar panels. And rather than throw money at new businesses, what about ending the policies that are closing down existing ones, like union-inflated wage rates and the effective ban on new gas fields? Yet again, business common sense in Canberra is not that common. All right, let's go to Canberra for the headlines. Joining us now, Sky News political reporter Cam Redden.
Good evening. Growth forecasts will be downgraded in next month's budget as uncertain economic times threaten to prolong the inflation pain.
The global economy is uncertain and unpredictable, fraught and fragile.
Conflict in the Middle East threatens to undo some of the progress in bringing inflation down. Figures for the first quarter of this year will be released on Wednesday, but are expected to show a further moderation.
We are seeing a slight uptick in the number of Australians who are defaulting on their mortgage.
Labor's cost of living tax cuts will be the centrepiece of Jim Chalmers' third budget.
We know that it's not mission accomplished, and if we can afford to do a little more than that, then those decisions will be taken in the next week or two.
The Prime Minister has taken aim at social media company X, formerly Twitter, for hosting content about last week's stabbing inside a Sydney church.
Social media has a responsibility.
E-Safety Commissioner Julie Inman-Grant has ordered the social media giant to remove graphic content relating to the incident. X, owned by billionaire Elon Musk, has vowed to fight the order, arguing removal of the content would amount to censorship.
This isn't about freedom of expression. This is about the dangerous implications that can occur when things that are simply not true are replicated and weaponised.
Newspoll has remained largely stable, with Labor maintaining its narrow lead. Labor's primary vote of 33% is almost on par with its return at the last election, while the coalition at 38% is up 2 points since then.
What that data is telling us is that the cost of living crisis in Australia is really beginning to bite.
Labor leads 51-49 on two-party terms, a result that would likely tip them into minority government if replicated on election day.
All right, it's Monday, a lot to get through. Joining me now, Dennis Shanahan, as he does, National Editor for The Australian every Monday. We'll start with the two polls out today if we can. The first, of course, is the most watched, that's Newspoll. It's got Labor trailing the coalition by 5 points there. We saw it on primary. Now, this is settling into a bit of a trend. The coalition has been leading on primary for the past 6 months. On two-party preferred, that gap has narrowed down to just 2 points, 51-49 to the government. Meanwhile, the latest Resolve Political Monitor, that's another poll, there has the coalition widening their vote lead over Labor and Peter Dutton gaining ground as preferred Prime Minister. Well, Dennis, give us some of your observations on these two polls.
Peter, it is clear that there is an incremental trend, but it is favouring the coalition on primary vote. Labor, not only do we have the News poll and Resolve, we had previously the Freshwater poll, also showing Labor at a record low primary vote. So Labor is in trouble on the primary vote. And of course, this is going to be so important when it comes to the next election, because it was elected with a record low primary vote. If that's any lower, then it's all going to be decided on preferences, and it's going to make majority government very difficult. But the other thing about all of these polls, and the News poll shows it today as well as the Resolve poll, is that while people are reluctant to make big moves as far as the parties are concerned, it's all, within the margin of error. It's a little bit. It is a trend slightly towards the coalition. But what they are saying, people are saying that they are not liking what they see about the government's economic management. They do not like what they're seeing about cost of living. And what they are saying is, and this has been the case for a long time, they can't afford a large shock. That isn't a surprise bill, a dog going to the vet for an operation, a car accident, who knows what. They are saying they cannot afford a shock. Now, this means that cost of living is still the prime issue, and that will continue to drive the primary vote for all the parties. It is still the big issue and, of course, the big headline for the budget.
Yeah, that was a stat that came out of Resolve. I thought that was very telling, Dennis. It's now 55%, so a clear majority. The fridge breaks down, a car needs new tyres, the sort of stuff that's expected but not necessarily anticipated. That would bring most people to the wall. This is the focus for the government. This is where I think the whole election will turn. Everything else will be peripheral to this. But, when you get a trend that looks like minority government now for a number of months, when you get the coalition ahead for 6 on primary, you've got a lot then resting on the Treasurer's shoulders, given this budget's likely to be the last one we have before the next federal election. He was out today talking about the deteriorating global economic outlook. When you and I started, when I started in politics, you were there before me, all those years ago in the late 90s, you used to get a bump out of a budget. You might have got a bump a few years after that, at least in the Howard era, but the bump never lasted. I don't think you even get a bump these days. What do you think's the task for Chalmers?
Well, I think that Jim Chalmers really needs to take a leaf out of Peter Costello's first budget in the Howard government, because that got a bump, but it wasn't a sugar hit. It was actually the electorate saying, we understand you have to deliver a tougher budget. And while Jim Chalmers is saying things like, we're going to change the growth forecast, clearly there is more bad news coming. He's still saying that there will be a surplus. And he's trying to say that it's more nuanced, the response. He is saying there'll be cost of living, but he keeps saying it won't be that pushes up inflation. What he's saying is that he's trying to produce another surplus to try and keep the pressure on keeping debt down and keeping inflation down, rather than some sort of a cash splash or giveaway, which gives you a sugar hit. I think that Jim Chalmers is in a very difficult position. He has a Prime Minister who is saying he wants to relieve cost of living pressure. Cost of living is the most immediate danger to voters. The electorate has changed, the demographics have changed. And so Jim Chalmers is trying to walk a tightrope between trying to say, I do want to produce a responsible economic budget, just not probably as tough as Peter Costello's first, but one which people can appreciate is for the longer term, and also trying to say, oh, yes, we're going to try and have relief for cost of living. I think this is a real test for Jim Chalmers as Treasurer, and we've seen Treasurers in the past stand up to Prime Ministers and say, this is my budget and this is the way we are going to do it. I think it'll be a big test for Jim Chalmers, and I don't think it's going to be the last budget before the election. I think Anthony Albanese has already flagged a March budget next year.
We will see on that score. Talk to me about, this has never happened before. I don't even know if it's constitutional. But in the Melbourne seat of Higgins, we've got two candidates putting their hand up to run together as independents. They reckon they can job share the role part-time, week on, week off. One's a former staffer lawyer, Lucy Bradlow. The other's a finance executive, Bronwyn Bock. Give me a break, Dennis.
Yeah, well, tell them they're dreaming. Look, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I can see so many difficulties here on the idea that somehow an electorate would be able to vote for and elect two people as one representative. They're not Siamese twins. I don't know how they're going to do this because there are so many areas where it comes down to an individual MP. It also comes down, what if one of them is found to be in breach of one of the constitutional measures, say citizenship? Does that mean both of them then are ousted? What if they both show up in Parliament on the same day to vote when they can only cast one vote? This, it's also been floated in the UK. It was knocked out by the High Court because it was just seemed to be too hard, unconstitutional, and a matter for the Parliament to decide on legislation before somebody tried to try and force the Electoral Commission to allow such a bizarre idea. It's not a bad idea to have, the amount of work that MPs have to do shared about, but you can't cut an MP in half. So much of this relies on individual judgment and individual votes. I just can't see it working at all.
It's a PR stunt. That's what I reckon it is, Dennis. I'll leave it there. Thanks for your insights. All right, after the break, there could be no end to the union's power if a chilling new push is given the green light with the Fair Work Commission. This relates to mining. I'll get you those details in a moment. Plus, how much the government's rhetoric on Elon Musk and this online misinformation stuff is just a way to put a Trojan horse into the Parliament and crack down on free speech online. Welcome back. Free speech online. Now, to be honest, I am still struggling with where to find that line. It's an issue that's got huge consequences for how critics hold governments to account in the future. And we know that shutting down debate is the holy grail for the hard left. Chris Merritt coming up. We'll tease that one out together. But first, another troubling development when it comes to industrial relations in this country under Labor, with a new proposal that would see union delegates spend as much time on union business as the job that employers pay them to do. Now, that's the proposal currently before the industrial umpire as part of a push from the Mining and Energy Union. If adopted, would see a wide-ranging scope for what constitutes union business. And this all comes as a consequence of Labor's last round of IR legislation passed late last year. Joining me now to discuss the potential ramifications of this push is the CEO of the Minerals Council of Australia, Tanya Constable. Well, Tanya, thank you for your time. When you put this in simple terms, it's basically business paying for union work. Have I got that right?
You're absolutely right, Peter. This is the unions forcing employers to pay for delegates' rights. That means that if a union delegate wants to do training, they can do up to 5 days training on whatever they like, wherever they like. They can make sure that that they are going to go off and travel around to any site that they want to travel to. An employer is going to have to pay for that privilege. So whatever the union delegate wants to do, the employer is going to have to pay for it.
And this, of course, saves the union lots of costs. It makes you basically put a permanent union person on your staff if you're running a big company, paid for by you, but basically working for the CFMEU or whoever it might be. When you've got about 8% only now of the private sector workforce belonging to the union, I mean, these changes would effectively mean the union could still represent a non-union employee. Is that how it works?
Well, there's 8% of the entire private workforce that is represented by unions, but unions will have 100% of control. So that means that they will have more control than management over making decisions. They'll be able to communicate, disseminate information to whomever they want on a work site, across any sort of site, across different organisations on a site, and the employer or other employers won't be able to do anything about it. They will have unlimited, unfettered access to workers, whether they represent them within the union or not.
Is there a limit to how many of these union delegates could be on a business, within a business or on a work site?
There is no limit to what a union is able to represent on a work site. So if they want 10% of that workforce as union delegates, they can have 10% of that workforce as delegates and won't be able to do anything about it. Now, that's a high cost to the employer, where an employer might have to allow that union delegate to have time to go and meet in meetings, to be able to do training with people, to go off and do political lobbying, to go to Canberra to represent their people at that time. They're able to do all of those things for not just their own workforce, but any sort of workforce across these sites.
How likely are these sorts of changes going to be in terms of flowing through to smaller businesses beyond mining?
Well, we're really worried about this because it's not just mine sites and the mining industry that's going to be affected. It's every business across Australia that's going to be impacted by these changes. We're hearing stories already of the United Workers Union that are putting up delegates talking about how they've been able to go off and do political lobbying. This is a worker that sits in a childcare industry that should be looking after our children. Instead, she is travelling around just doing her political lobbying, being able to go off and visit different sites, talk to politicians about her concerns that might be there. The employer has no ability to rein that in. She's able to have unfettered access, do whatever she likes, and that's going to be legal under the changes. That's a really big concern for not just the mining industry, but should be for every industry across Australia. We're really worried about that for every employer across Australia, including, of course, the mining industry.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Tanya, we're not concerned about the unions lobbying in Canberra or people who work for the CFMEU in head office doing all the lobbying we're talking about. The concern is then the displacement of all these additional people out into businesses, times that by 1,000, 5,000, could be more than that, who knows. Every business could have employees who are basically union workers, for want of a better term, and they are constantly out there on outreach, not the work the company pays them to do. Thank you for your time. Just quickly, when are we likely to get a decision from the Fair Work Commission on this?
Well, they're meeting at the moment, taking evidence from different organisations, but we expect to see a decision on this over the next couple of weeks, Peter.
All right, thank you, Tanya. We'll stay across at Tanya Constable there, CEO of the Minerals Council, and she's right, it'll flow through to small businesses, which is why this matters. Let's go back to the whole issue of freedom of speech. Now, this comes after that demand from Australia's e-Safety Commissioner for the footage of Bishop Emmanuel's stabbing to be removed. And tied up in all of this is the renewed push by federal Labor to pass new laws to crack down, it says, on misinformation and disinformation, which goes well beyond violence. Joining me now to discuss the legal ins and outs, legal affairs contributor at The Australian, Chris Merritt. Well, Chris, what's being demanded to be taken down? It's the vision of the stabbing, Okay, explain why it must come down, because this is a knife attack and it's violent, but the whole internet is full of violent images. Or is this being asked to be brought down because it's related to the prosecution of an alleged terror incident? What's the grounds here?
I'd love to know. I've had a look at the official statement coming out of the E-Safety Commissioner's office, and it's vague and bureaucratic and doesn't expand the body of knowledge. It talks about harm. That's a very vague term. I suspect that this entire issue is being used as a stalking horse, if you like, for the reintroduction of the government's failed misinformation and disinformation bill. And remember, that bill was withdrawn after widespread concern, not just by people in the media, but by the Law Council of Australia, the Victorian Bar Council. The Law Council actually warned that if this misinformation and disinformation scheme went ahead, we would have a bureaucrat and tech companies deciding what information we can and cannot receive. Now, we've got perfectly good laws in this country against inciting violence that are not being enforced. Now, if anything's going to be taken down, I would have thought that the E-Safety Commissioner and the government would be insisting that actions and words that breach our existing laws on inciting violence should be the first thing to go. The vision of the knife attack was repulsive, and responsible media organisations have not broadcast it. But we've got laws, criminal laws, that are not being enforced. And I think the authorities here, from the Prime Minister and various ministers who are down, they seem to be seizing on this to treat Elon Musk as a bogeyman and the stalking horse for their bill, which was just too vague. That's what's worrying me.
And I think if it wasn't Elon Musk, if it was the Twitter of old, which was sort of the citadel of the left, I don't think it would be used as an example. I mean, I said at the top of the show, Chris, I'm a conservative on the internet. I'm not a libertarian. I do think there are lines, and I think these days the depravity that you find online, the dark web and the horrific child abuse that's regularly there, I think there are lines that are crossed. I think things should be brought down. But what I don't understand here is none of the stuff that could have radicalised this young man or any young person, that doesn't come down. Just the effect of radicalisation, this alleged terror attack, that's what's being targeted. So I find that the subjective power that we would give a bureaucrat here, the real risk of political interference, that's my great concern. Chris, what about you?
Look, I share that concern. We don't want a government official to be editor-in-chief of the internet. And if the misinformation and disinformation scheme goes ahead, that's effectively what would happen. We would have a bureaucrat capable of imposing $1 million fines, $1 million penalties for material that is defined in very vague terms. Just technically, if you're going to enact a law, it should be imposing big penalties like this. It should be tightly defined. That's just a technical concern. But the policy objection is: do we really want the government and big tech to collude over what we can and cannot see? We've got good laws. We should enforce them instead of scratching around looking for new ones.
Yeah, and I'd have to say too, and I mentioned this earlier, if Inman Grant had been just as effective going after anti-Semitic hate from October 7 and beyond, I'd be a little bit more sympathetic. But this is the first time she's, popped out on anything much in the last 6 months, and to come out on this issue strikes me as a bit bizarre. Hey, what's the latest on this whole Higgins, Lerman, and obviously David Shiraz? This is the defamation case, Linda Reynolds. There was a statement on Saturday from Brittany Higgins saying that she was, quote, sorry. She talked about perceptions and feelings about what happened in the weeks after her rape. Her thoughts and feelings being different from theirs. Theirs being, of course, Reynolds and a former Chief of Staff, Fiona Brown. Reynolds has reported today saying she wants Higgins to accept, I presume without qualification, the findings of Justice Lee that there was no cover-up, at least on the side of the Liberal Party. I think there's plenty of political collusion with the Labor Party, but on the side of the Liberals, there was no cover-up. Do you think she's going to get that? Do you think we're going to get back into court with this one?
The latter. I think it'll almost certainly go to court. Linda Reynolds, after the result of the Lerman defamation case, Linda Reynolds has got a rock-solid argument. The issue is whether Linda Reynolds bullied or victimised Miss Higgins, and that seems to have been resolved pretty conclusively by Justice Lee. This case is, my personal view is I'd be glad to see the end of it, but we've just seen the beginning. The Reynolds case should be an even bigger circus than what we've just seen. Katie Gallagher has been subpoenaed to be a witness. Lisa Wilkinson has been subpoenaed to be a witness. So this case will focus not on whether or not Miss Higgins suffered sexual assault. That's been decided on the civil standard, but this will go directly to the issue that so bedeviled the Morrison government and effectively damaged and probably fatally damaged the political career of Linda Reynolds. That is, did she mistreat or victimise Miss Higgins? And it seems a pretty lay-down misère at this point.
And of course, once you start digging around in court and seeking evidence, as you know, lots of things in relation to that compensation payment or the issues where it was put on Linda Reynolds not to give evidence in the compensation negotiation, even though she was the employer of Brittany Higgins. I think that's all going to be fascinating. Thank you, Chris Merritt. I'll speak to you again soon. All right, after the break, both sides now playing down Israel's attack on Iran. Are we seeing a de-escalation or will there be more? Plus, an academic paper that casts doubt on the extent of women and children deaths from the Hamas-controlled health authorities in Gaza. Welcome back. Still the calm. Cracks are emerging within the coalition when it comes to its nuclear policy, or are they? The panel weighs in just a moment. But first, Palestine has failed to obtain full membership of the United Nations after the US vetoed its request to the UN Security Council last week. 12 member states voted in favour of the motion. The UK and Switzerland abstained, which meant the US stepped in then and used its veto. It comes as Israel proved it could breach Tehran's air defences, targeting a military base in Iran's Isfahan province on Friday. For more, I'm joined by Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, former DepSec at the Department of Defence, Peter Jennings. Well, thank you for your time, Peter, as always. Take me through this strike on Friday. There seems to have been over the weekend a real de-escalation. What we can see, where the Iranians couldn't get through the Israeli air defence, the Israelis certainly could the other way into Iran. Is that perhaps why Iran's pulled back?
Yes, I think this has perhaps come as a bit of a shock to Iran, Peter. They sent what is now being reported as potentially up to 500 missiles and drones into Israeli airspace, and 99% of them were shot down. And then within a few days, Israel blinded Iran by knocking out its air defence radars in Syria, and with a small number of drones managed to hit the target which they were aiming at, which was a military airbase. I think this is going to lead the leaders in Tehran to think, look, maybe we can't be as confident about our military capability as all that. And I think they're going to pull back in terms of direct confrontation with Israel and go back to what they've done for years, which is to attack Israel through their proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, and other proxy groups in the Middle East.
What about this paper out today? 3 Australian academics say the claims, the numbers of women and children killed in Gaza are statistically impossible The authorities have said that 70% of the estimated 30,000 killed since the start of the war are all women and children. But the paper says there's serious doubt about this. A lot of these deaths are not registered with hospitals. They talk about the fact that, of course, the data can be manipulated. The data has basically no males in the 30,000 dead. This has always been the issue with Gaza more broadly, because a terror organisation in Hamas was elected to run the province or the area, the territory, and who can trust a terror organisation?
Yes, of course, Peter, and the figures have never looked right, not least the Hamas authorities never report any military combat casualties killed. And I think we've just got to conclude that, obviously there have been significant numbers of casualties. There will have been significant numbers of civilian casualties. I guess we can see that. But the figures that have come out of the Hamas Health Authority are really part of the broader propaganda campaign that Hamas has been running internationally to discredit Israel. The other thing that I'm struck by all of this is how guilelessly those Hamas figures have been reported by many Western media outlets. You never hear Israeli figures reported.
Absolutely.
You never hear their claims of killing Hamas fighters. You never hear Israeli claims reporting the numbers of Israeli soldiers which have died in the conflict. So why is it that so many media outlets in Western democracies have been happy to report the propaganda of a terrorist organisation, Hamas, without a second glance, when on the face of it the figures just look completely unbelievable?
Let's talk about radicalisation. Predominantly we'll talk about online radicalisation, the stuff that targets mainly young boys and men. Now, there are de-radicalisation programs. We hear about them a fair bit, but let's not forget, and I remember this vividly, after that London Bridge terror attack, the person who was just out of jail, who committed that atrocity, he had undergone, they said successfully, de-radicalisation in prison. Well, fat chance he did. And there was a House of Lords review about the same time, and it cited that 95% of the programs in prisons for de-radicalisation are, quote, ineffective. I think Australians really don't understand how vulnerable and how targeted young people in particular can be online. And they're not just targeted, are they, by Islamist figures from Australia. I mean, there's a global game trying to activate young people in the West, isn't there?
That's right, Peter. During the days of the Islamic State operating in Iraq and Syria, they had a very sophisticated global recruitment and radicalisation campaign running through the internet, which was responsible in part for several hundred Australians seeking to go over to Syria to join them, and many thousand from across Western democracies in other countries. So we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which this radicalisation process is not about young children in Australia viewing obscure Islamic preachers. It's actually videos that have been designed to appeal to young, impressionable minds, precisely for the purpose of recruiting them. And it's possible, at least, that some version of that is what's happened in the terrorist incident in Sydney more recently. On the de-radicalisation point, I'm not a deep specialist in this, but I read the literature, and what that tells me is that across the democracies there has been no successful de-radicalisation program developed for people that have been convicted of terrorism crimes. The only country which I think has had some success actually is Indonesia, with the Jemaah Islamiyah cohort from a couple of decades ago. But I think that's unique to Indonesia, a Muslim state. I don't think it's something which is able to be brought into the Australian context. So radicalisation still happens. It's global. It's a business effectively. De-radicalisation is something that we've simply not worked out how to do properly. And there's no evidence that that has been achieved, I think, in any Western democracy. No,
yet we spend plenty of money trying to do it, and I don't think carefully enough to track where that money goes either. Peter Jennings, thank you as always. I might mention there behind Peter Jennings, behind most of my guests tonight, you can see that glorious red maple tree. We call it the budget tree in Canberra because it comes into that brilliant red colour just about budget time, which is sort of what about now. Right after the break, debate over potential nuclear sites, they say, is causing a rift amongst the coalition. How true is that? Plus, what on earth is happening in Queensland? The LNP are supporting Labor's insane emissions target. Panel time. Let's bring them in. LNP MP Keith Pitt, former Minister, of course, and former Howard Government Minister himself, Gary Hargrave. Well, gentlemen, welcome. Let's start with this brouhaha of a sorts. We don't know if it really is, but you'll tell us, Keith. Behind the scenes, inside the coalition, the Sydney Morning Herald says you're all bluing amongst each other. David Littleproud, he doesn't want the coalition to dictate where the proposed facilities will be, according to, we love these, anonymous Nationals MPs. God, if I had $1 for every time an anonymous MP said something that's not true, we'd all be rich, wouldn't we? I wouldn't be here on Sky News. What's spin here, Keith? What substance?
What substance, Peter, is Chris Bowen's doing his pills. That's what I'm seeing today. Look, the reality is very straightforward. You've been through this before. This is it's a difficult policy. It's one we need to have a conversation with the Australian people. That will take time, and that time's been taken. So we're committed to nuclear. Peter Dutton said so in his budget reply last year. I expect he'll say it again this year. And the details will come. Yep. But of course they get prodded and poked. You know how it is.
Yeah, and I think, people on the left are actually a bit scared this time round because I think broadly polls are showing the Australian public are up for at least the debate. And this is where Labor's absent. But I tell you what I'm shocked about up your way. If I can, Gary, on Thursday, your mob, the Queensland LNP, they voted in favour for this insane target from Labor, 75% emissions cut by 2035. Now, they're also a bit crazy when they were pro the voice until they saw the result from the people and they wound that back fast. What's going on here?
Well, they are making courageous decisions, Peter, but let's face it, parliamentary parties in the Liberal Party tradition are allowed to make those decisions for themselves. But look, 70-odd% of the grassroots have passed a couple of motions the last couple of conferences of the Liberal National Party in Queensland. One was in favour of nuclear, 70% passed. And the other one was against the idea of emissions targets, 70% pass. So I think that before the voters get a chance to judge on this, the party members are probably going to have a bit to say in a conference that's due in early July. So it'll be an interesting space to watch. I wish them well.
I was your guest speaker at the last conference last year, and they were ropeable about the voice. Now, of course, I said David Crisafulli's unwound that one. But what's going on here, Keith? You can't back this, surely.
Peter, Queensland people desperately need a change of government. Youth crime, health, all the things around ambulance ramping. We desperately need the LNP to win, and I support them 100%. I want them to win. And I oppose Labor's policies. I oppose Labor's emissions madness. I was up at Gracemere with Cole Boyce on the weekend, and we are seeing shots of entire ridgelines being dynamited, dozers running through pristine wilderness to put up these monstrosities just so Labor feels good. They won't work. Nope. And as Gary has said, it'll be the members that put forward their view. That's why they're in a political party, and I think they'll be very loud about what their position is. But I oppose Labor's emissions plans because they won't work, they'll cost a fortune, and they can't be delivered.
You are a good man, and I'm hoping and praying that the LNP membership, and I talk to them every night here on Sky News, please bang the drum to your state MP like you did last year on The Voice. Let's get some common sense before Crisafulli becomes a premier and he's locked into this nonsense. Gary, let's come down to Victoria. Youth crime is so bad that locals in the Amambrin estate area, so this is near Werribee, well, they've decided to patrol their own streets. They're doing this every night between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m, and they're fed up with the machete-wielding gangs terrorising the area.
It's happening everywhere, and where Labor is really vulnerable is they're very soft on crime. It's society's fault every time these people do these things. And the use of the machete is just frightening. Something you wouldn't see outside of a cane field in far north Queensland is now being used in suburban Australia. So if it's happening around Werribee, it's happening around Coorparoo, it's happening around various parts of Sydney and other places as well. You've just got to throw the book at them. There should be very straight language. If you're going to do the crime, you're going to do the time. The kids have got to go to jail. You just got to lock them up. And if you've got to build more jails, well, build more jails, I say.
And let's stop the importation too, because these aren't made in Australia. Most of them come from overseas, these machetes. Gentlemen, thank you. See you next week. All right, that's it for me. Andrew's up next. See you tomorrow night.